This is ILTV on the hour, bringing you the biggest stories from Israel and the Middle East. I'm Caleb Ben David. Today is day 643 of the war in Gaza, and let's get into all the top headlines this hour. Prime Minister Netanyahu will reportedly be returning home to Israel before the weekend after two intensive meetings with President Trump in Washington focused on reaching a ceasefire agreement with Hamas in Gaza. Netanyahu will be apparently heading home with issues still unresolved for a hostage deal. Netanyahu told reporters that he and the president have shared objectives to end Hamas rule and free the hostages.
President Trump and I have a common goal. We want to achieve the release of our hostages. We want to end Hamas rule in Gaza. We want to make sure that Gaza does not pose a threat to Israel anymore. In pursuing this common goal, we have a common strategy. Not only do we have a common strategy, we have common tactics. This doesn't involve pressure, doesn't involve coercion, it involves full coordination. President Trump wants a deal, but not at any price. I want a deal, but not at any price. Israel has security requirements and other requirements, and we're working together to try to achieve it.
The Prime Minister also met in Washington last night with some family members of the hostages, telling them that progress had been made this week towards a deal. Meanwhile, in Doha, Israeli negotiators reportedly handed new maps to mediators showing the lines of a partial IDF withdrawal during a proposed ceasefire deal with Hamas in Gaza. Now, the U.S. has reportedly pressed Israel to limit the IDF presence in Gaza as part of the agreement. The previous withdrawal lines proposed by Israel were rejected by Hamas, and the issue has become a sticking point in the mediated negotiations. Israel is insisting that the IDF remain in the Morag corridor in southern Gaza, where it plans to create a so-called humanitarian zone for the civilian population in the Rafah area. U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff delayed his announced trip to Doha earlier this week, indicating that a deal may not yet be within reach. Well, for more on the prospects of a deal, let's go to our Shosh Bedrosian, who is at Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. And
President
Shosh,
Trump and I...
Shosh, there was a lot of anticipation, maybe some kind of big announcement in Washington this week of a hostage deal. The odds of that are looking slimmer right now. This has to be another trying time for, of course, the hostage families.
Of course, absolutely a trying time, a difficult and a painful time as well. I think the majority of people here in Israel believe there could have been some type of joint announcement between Netanyahu and President Trump during his time at the White House. But I don't think that because there wasn't a joint announcement doesn't mean something won't happen. We actually just learned recently that back in February, Netanyahu discussed plans to attack Iran with the United States. So who knows what could come out of this meeting with President Trump and with Netanyahu. Of course, there has been a lot of hope, specifically cautious hope for the public here in Israel. Everyone has kind of been in this waiting period here, Kalev. You know, of course, we expected some momentum from this ceasefire that's established with Iran and Israel for there to be some type of movement with a deal for the end of this war inside of Gaza. You know, officials from Steve Witkoff to President Trump to, you know, Netanyahu himself saying that there could be a deal very, very soon. And here we are in these weeks that these officials said a deal could be reached, and we're still waiting to hear what progress has actually been made. I will say that within the last day, Hamas has actually publicly said that they will agree to release 10 of these hostages. They say that they are showing, quote, flexibility and positivity in these talks. Could potentially be a good sign for what is to come. We know that you said Steve Witkoff has delayed his trip to Doha, Qatar, ceasefire. Although Witkoff did say he is hoping that a deal could still be reached by the end of this week. Remember, it is only Thursday. A lot can change. Although we are hearing some reports that Israeli officials say, this may take more than 24 hours to close these gaps in this deal that still currently exists, which includes any type of IDF withdrawal, trying to figure out, how troops will pull out, what parts of Gaza that will include, in addition to a new humanitarian aid mechanism. We know that Hamas has said they want this GHF, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, out of the Gaza Strip. It's American and Israeli backed. They're trying to get this United Nations mechanism back in. So right now, these two sticking points that we continue to hear reported that are causing obstacles are the IDF deployment and what that will look like in the future, in addition to how aid will be distributed inside of the enclave. Kalev?
Right, and we also have to also keep in mind we are still now talking about a partial hostage withdrawal, with only 10 of the 20 believed to be remaining hostages surviving. And then even that, of course, is just a difficult proposition still for the hostage families.
Not only that, we're hearing that officials could be at a point where if there are 10 living hostages released, Kalev, how would that be prioritized? Which hostages would come out first? I think the conversation in Israeli society right now is what a difficult position that must be for an official to have to decide the dire conditions over another dire condition hostage. These hostages have been held in deplorable, inhumane conditions, things that most people will never have to experience in their lives based off of the testimonies we have continued to hear for more than 600 days now of the conditions these hostages are forced into. Of course, these families are hoping for a comprehensive deal that will bring home the 20 living hostages, not just the 10, but something that will get every single hostage home, including the deceased hostages, which is about 30 at this time. So bringing every single last hostage home. But of course, to save one life, I think these families agree is of the utmost importance. I think it's just a matter of which hostages would be released first, which is the ultimate pain that some of these officials who are having to decide that now have to bear. But Israeli society will likely gather, of course, in large numbers here in Hostages Square back on Saturday after Shabbat, as they have been doing for every single week since October 7th, pleading for their loved ones to come back home.
All right. Again, difficult time, and hopefully there'll be some good news for those hostages' families and really for all of us in the coming days. Shosh Bedrosian there in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Now, yesterday in Washington, Prime Minister Netanyahu met with U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and other senior defense officials. Their talks focused on countering the threat from Iran, regional security cooperation, and strengthening the strategic alliance between Israel and the U.S. And Netanyahu also held talks with congressional leaders from both parties, including Republican Senate Majority Leader John Thune and Democratic Minority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer. Well, for more on the Prime Minister's Washington trip, we are joined from New York by Eric Mandel, founder director of the Middle East Political and Information Network. And Eric, thanks for joining us. Before we start breaking down the specifics of some of these issues, I want to get an overall view, your overall view of the trip itself. Of course, for the Prime Minister Netanyahu, definitely a more positive trip than his last visit to Washington. No unpleasant surprises here. A real chemistry, it would seem, between him and President Trump. They're on the same page, it would seem. But some disappointment here in Israel that so far the trip hasn't produced a dramatic announcement, especially as regards to a hostage deal. So what's your overall view?
Prime Minister Netanyahu has basically made it very clear again and again that there's no daylight between President Trump and Israel, between the two of them, and that everything is coordinated, and that won't be a deal at any price, that we want it desperately, but we're not going to give up everything. And when people really look at this, it's very difficult to see how this is going to work. Who has leverage? The only leverage, or the strongest leverage, is President Trump on Prime Minister Netanyahu. And President Trump thinks that Prime Minister Netanyahu owes him for Iran, and he knows that he can be fickle. And so right now, everything looks good. This is an unprecedented kind of trip because they really didn't have all the photo ops that they normally have. They did this quietly, the negotiations. But when you look at it, how are you going to make all of this work? What are Israel's bottom red lines with Gaza? Now, publicly, Netanyahu says it is, well, I think one of the things not spoken about is the buffer zone, the 1 kilometer buffer zone that goes all around the Philadelphia corridor. But now you've gotten in the Moreg corridor, which is basically separating Khan Younis from Rafah, that you can build a humanitarian city on the other side. But the north may be even more important. So I don't think President Trump wants to go into all these details, knowing that Beit Hanoun may be more important than the Morag axis of what's going on. So what's going to come out of this is sooner or later, President Trump wants a deal. How much will Bibi give up? And then when you take a step back and look at this from 30,000 feet, you're going to almost condemn the remaining 10 hostages because Hamas is not going to be disarmed. Who is going to disarm Hamas? There may be a fig leaf that they may leave Gaza, but sooner or later you're going to have some kind of deal at the very end. And so probably when you really look at this should be a deal of all the hostages now. I think most Israelis would like that kind of deal. It's the one that makes the most sense. But I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu, to keep his coalition together, and you hate to say politics, could be involved with these hostages, cannot do that type of deal, which is what really needs to be done. And remember, President Trump also said that he's going, this is supposedly, that he's going to guarantee after the 60-day ceasefire that Israel's not going to restart military operations again. And then where are you? So, you throw out all this stuff, and really, what are you left at the end? You're going to get a deal, 60 days, but what about the final hostages? How do you get them out? How does Israel have security? I was with Southern Command about 2 months ago, and I asked them if you gave up that 1 kilometer buffer zone, could you ensure the safety of the people on the Gaza envelope? And he says, it's not that we couldn't ensure it, even though it would be incredibly difficult. He says, but they're going to see Palestinians, they're going to leave. And if Israel can't bring the communities home, whether in the north or the south, then this war is going to have a mixed result at the very end.
Right. And Eric, you've mentioned President Trump really clearly looking for a deal, or at least that 60-day ceasefire right now. He doesn't want to go into details, but some of those details that Israel has been talking about, the Morag corridor, establishing a humanitarian area in southern Gaza, while presumably the northern areas would be built, seem to fit in with what initially seemed to be the sort of Trump plan or Trump vision for the day after in Gaza. President Trump seems to have shifted focus away from that now. How do you read at least where the administration is standing on what a day after in Gaza would look like?
Well, I think one of the important things here is something that Israel hasn't done, and maybe it's beginning to do now and maybe too late, is how do you separate the population from Hamas fighters? By the way, we have to be honest here. Most of the Gazans, at least according to polls, are still with Hamas. This is a radicalized population. So setting it up and turning even humanitarian areas that aren't armed into places that are going to have a different mindset, a different educational system, it's going to be generations. This stuff isn't going to happen very quickly. So I think, I think expectations need to be managed here of what's going to come next in Gaza. And maybe it's time for Israel to take half a loaf here, and maybe say Hamas is going to be there. We need some fig leaves to be left over, but to get all the hostages out right now.
Well, you say a fig leaf, but presumably there's been talk about Israel making some kind of deal to end the war, but that would include maybe progress towards expanding the Abraham Accord, security alliances at least with maybe countries like Saudi Arabia and Syria. Whether these are fig leaves or not, what would you see? What would it take for Israel? What would it be worth for Israel to get in order to agree to some kind of ceasefire where at least there were certainly parts of Gaza still either under Hamas control or certainly elements of Hamas still left in Gaza?
I think if Israel was able to keep its 1 kilometer buffer zone, keep the Philadelphia corridor, and got real normalization. Saudis are less to make a deal with Israel, because Israel has, even though Israel is now the strong man after Iran, that's already done. Maybe they don't need to take a risk. I was in contact with the Saudis after October 7th, and they told me they didn't know how radicalized their population was against Israel. That tell you generations of education there that was not pro-Israel, to say the least, even though they've made some reforms that are there. So maybe on Gaza, Israel will again take half loaf. When I was talking about some kind of fig leaf of Hamas saying they're going to be disarmed, or that there is some withdrawal of some of their leaders. But if Hamas is standing with his final thing, that Israel have to be removed from every centimeter of the Gaza Strip. That means the buffer zone, Philadelphia corridor, Morag in the north, and Hamas is not leaving disarmed. And again, practically, I don't even see how that's possible. Then what are you going to have at the end of the day here? But then again, this is also about politics. Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to keep his coalition together. The ceasefire, 60 days, we're just kicking the can a little bit down the road here. And that's a problem. That's a problem for the remaining hostages that are going to be there. And I think President Trump is going to lose patience with Israel if it restarts the war after 60 days. And again, one of the most important things in the Middle East here, everybody's kind of forgotten Iran. It's only a couple of weeks ago that Iran was going on.
Let me ask you about Iran, because obviously that was probably also major on the agenda. I should say that there are reports out of Israel today, Israeli sources saying they believe that uranium that was in Fordow was not removed, that actually was buried there at that site. But still, that leaves the question of, if Iran starts to enrich again, who takes action against it? We've heard reports of the U.S. Supplying Israel with B-2 bombers. So how do you see that going forward? Who's going to have the responsibility to deal with Iran, for example, if it starts enrichment again?
Well, I think Israel's happy to enforce it on its own. The question is, will the president say that Israel, like it has in Lebanon now, has freedom of action to strike when either it begins its ballistic missile production again? By the way, that is an enormous threat that's underestimated. The enrichment, the question, or remember, it's beyond enrichment, it's weaponization. And Israel definitely hit that with its the metallurgy, the uranium conversion places into metals, from gas to metals. That they hit that in Isfahan. So will Israel be able to have freedom of action there? Will Israel, and by the way, we have to remember that Wickoff is also going to be speaking, forgetting about dealing with in Doha, he's also going to be speaking with the Iranians to try to find a final Iran nuclear deal. And so Israel's minimum is Israel has to have freedom of action. It has to be able to stop the refinancing of the proxy, stop ballistic missile production. And there's no ifs, ands, or doubts that Iran is going to want to restart its program. And many people believe that it even has now more incentive to do that. And will President Trump have restraints on Israel? You don't need American help for Israel to just mow the grass there again and again, but it can't. But just like in Lebanon now, and that's the next thing you'll hear, pressure of Israel being told to remove from its 5 strategic locations in southern Lebanon, because Hamas will be disarmed, Hezbollah will be disarmed in the north. Who's going to really make that happen? I spoke ago about IDF could do in Lebanon, and there's a limit what they could do on Hezbollah, and there's a limit what you could do with Hamas in Gaza, because Israel, it does not want to remain and occupy it, and with Iran, there's going to be mowing the grass. So there is so much more complexities. This is not what President Trump wants, which is a victory dance. You can claim it, but there's still so much more work to go on, and the daylight cannot be seen in the Middle East between them. But there are other opportunities for normalization as a price for Israel to conceding more in Gaza. And those places, low-hanging fruit, could be Azerbaijan, it could be Indonesia. It doesn't necessarily need to be Saudi Arabia. So you have these other possibilities. And what will President Trump do? This is sort of a little bit of a bartering here. But I worry for the hostages there, but I also worry about Israel's security in a post-October 7th world and the Israeli people.
Right. What would President Trump do? That's always a tough question to try to answer. Dr. Eric Mandel there. Thank you for trying, though, and helping us with that. Dr. Eric Mandel, thank you for joining us on ILTV.
Thank you.
Now, in other security news, an IDF soldier was killed during an attempted Hamas abduction in southern Gaza. The fallen soldier was identified as Abraham Azulay, 25, from the community of Yitzhar in Samaria. Now, according to an ongoing IDF probe, several Hamas gunmen emerged from a tunnel and attacked IDF troops in Khan Younis. During the attack, gunmen tried to snatch Azulay's body. Other soldiers operating in the area opened fire at the terrorists and prevented the attempt. Now, elsewhere in Gaza, the IDF has begun encircling Beit Hanoun and destroying Hamas military infrastructure in the northern strip. The operation began yesterday, shortly after 5 IDF soldiers were killed and 14 wounded by a roadside bomb. This is the Air Force is conducting additional airstrikes in Gaza City. Beit Hanoun is very close to the Israeli border town of Sderot and has long been a hotspot for terrorists to launch rockets at Israel. Speaking last night at the National Security College graduation ceremony, the IDF Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, said the ongoing offensive against Hamas can enable a hostage deal with the terrorists. And overnight, Yemen's Houthi rebels, early this morning, I should say, Yemen's Houthi rebels fired a single missile towards central Israel. Air defenses were activated and the threat was neutralized. Sirens sounded in much of central Israel, the Jerusalem area, and some parts of Judea and Samaria. There were no injuries or damages caused. Earlier this week, Israel launched airstrikes against various Houthi targets in Yemen, including the Hodeidah port, amid ongoing missile attacks by the Iran-backed group. And moving to the northern front, the IDF staged a rare cross-border ground operation amid the ongoing truce with Lebanon. The Air Force has in recent weeks conducted near daily strikes against Hezbollah targets. Hezbollah has not fired back since the November truce went into effect. IDF troops staged their first ground incursion in months in what were described as targeted operations to dismantle military infrastructure belonging to Hezbollah. The Army did not give exact locations of the operation, but say the strikes will continue due to Hezbollah violations of the agreement by maintaining an armed presence in areas south of the Litani River. Now, during the ground operation, the Army located and destroyed weapon depots and firing positions, and the announcement came amid rising tensions over Hezbollah's disarmament. That is, of course, a key part of the agreement that was signed in November, which stopped cross-border exchanges that began a year ago. Well, for more on the security situation, let's go to political and military analyst, Reserves IDF Major Elliot Chodorf, who joins us from northern Israel. Elliot, we'll come back to the north in a minute, but let's just start with Gaza and the security situation, because we are seeing rising casualties over the past month in Gaza. How do you account for that? Is this just inevitable in part of the widening operation there? Should the IDF consider changing tactics or strategies?
We're seeing the result of actually two different phenomena that are converging. One is that Hamas has moved to a guerrilla phase of warfare. I think we need to understand that Hamas is sort of a multi-tiered power system. It started with a military structure. We talk about the brigades and the battalions of Hamas, which have been largely destroyed in the course of the fighting since October 7th. With that, they have shifted to guerrilla warfare, less organized. We're seeing fewer and fewer, and these are reports that are coming out of the field, fewer and fewer direct contact. Could easily be misunderstood as them being afraid to fight. They're simply following the dicta of Mao Zedong and Che Guevara, who wrote the books on this back in the day, which is attack when they're weak and flee when they're strong. So on the one hand, guerrilla warfare against a large armed force that is not in full maneuver mode, they've gained a certain initiative on the small tactical level, and we're seeing that in terms of casualties. Another factor that I think we have to take into account is that the IDF, the forces, are fatigued. They've been in combat for hundreds and hundreds of days, and that's having its effect. And as we read the reports of the different attacks, built into those reports, an error here, a miscalculation there, something else missed, that is symptomatic of long combat service and fatigue, and I think the two together, we're seeing what I would consider to be the IDF moving into something of a situation of diminishing returns, of higher investment and cost, and lower returns in terms of benefit against a guerrilla organization.
You know, we'll see if those troops get a break. If there is at least a short-term ceasefire, we'll know in the coming days, and we did discuss this. But I want to go back now to the north, where you are, because we did see these ground operations in Lebanon. This was how disturbing a sign is that regarding the truce that has been largely maintained there in the north since this past November.
Well, Khaled, I think if we describe it accurately and correctly, and this is what I would hope is what we're moving toward somewhere in Gaza as well, is that it's neither a ceasefire nor a truce. It's an agreement. And the agreement has within it a ceasefire sort of paragraph, but there are many other paragraphs as well. In other words, if we call it a ceasefire, what Israel is doing is a violation of the ceasefire. If we look at it for what it really is, which is an overall agreement that includes disarming Hezbollah, making sure it doesn't return to the south, and all sorts of things like that, when they violated, which they've done since day one, and Israel, the mechanisms of the agreement, whether it be UNIFIL or the Lebanese army, are either unwilling or incapable of enforcing the agreement, the IDF has been moving in and doing it. And by the way, it's been doing it almost since day one of the agreement, whether it's by airstrikes or drone strikes or whatever. And today we announced special forces operations in South Lebanon. I'm willing to bet that this was not the first time Israeli special forces operated against Hezbollah in Lebanon since the agreement. So this is ongoing. And again, they're violating the agreement. We're enforcing it.
And yet we just saw some reports just in recent days here in Israel of Israeli officials sort of pleased with the response they have from Lebanese, I guess, security officials about their intentions to disarm Hamas. How realistic a prospect of that is that Hezbollah will start to some degree disarming under pressure from the Lebanese government and army?
Lebanon country has an interest in disarming Hezbollah. Hezbollah became the armed power that it did following the Taif Agreement of 1989, which disarmed all the other factions and left Hezbollah as an exception. So what happened since 1989 up until this past year is that Hezbollah became the most powerful military force in Lebanon. The Lebanese army was number two. And so no matter what your politics were, and of course, we know from history in Lebanon, the Christians, the Druze were not supporters of Hezbollah, but when they're the most powerful team in town, you've got to at least nominally support them, because otherwise they're going to take you on and wipe you out. Now, for the first time since 1989, the Lebanese government and its military has an opportunity, and I want to emphasize an opportunity, to force Hezbollah to disarm. It's been weakened enough for them to do that. Whether they, and they want to, they certainly want to. Whether they will put their money where their mouth is, whether they'll go, push that to the point, because Hezbollah isn't going to do it willingly, those are the things we have to sit back and watch. So the positive aspect is, yes, we know what they want to do it. The question is, will they actually do it, and are they capable of doing it?
And until then, I mean, is Israel simply going to have to maintain this military posture? Should we expect more raids like the ones we just saw?
Absolutely. Hezbollah is not going to quit. Just like Hamas is not going to quit, just like Iran is not going to quit. We're talking about deep jihadi ideological structures, whether it's Iran, the state, or the others, the organizations. They're not walking away from this. They're going to lie, cheat, and steal as they always have. Agreements are going to be meaningless. And either we enforce them, or we're going to go right back to where we started from. And if we give them enough time, back to October 7th and the like. So even with agreements, it must be built into the agreement that Israel has the right to enforce the agreement if nobody else does.
All right. I think we'll just have to hope, and especially for all you residents of the North, that things remain relatively quiet there and people can continue to try to rebuild their lives there in the North. Major
Hope so.
Elliot Chodorf, thank you for joining us on ILTV.
My pleasure.
And that's a wrap on ILTV on the Hour, live from Israel and the Middle East. Every hour on the Hour, we're the only English news delivering live updates around the clock. Stay with us for more updates as developments unfold. I'm Kalev Ben David, and thank you for watching.